You saw him before he became himself. You saw the man buried beneath the silence, the man who flinched when you got too close, the man who didn't yet know how to hold what you give without trembling. But you saw him, and something ancient in you knew, not with logic, not with proof, with the kind of knowing that waits at the bottom of a lifetime of ache. A kind of knowing that recognizes home, even when the doors are still locked. You didn't fall in love with his charm. You fell into the part of him that hadn't yet arrived. And that's what no one else could see. That's what made it feel so inevitable. Because his eyes told one story, but his soul whispered another. And somewhere between the two, you were left waiting in a kind of invisible hallway, where his arms said, "Stay," but his fears said, "Run," where the universe pushed you toward him, but his wounds pulled him away from you. You tried to meet him in the space between. You tried to speak in the language of silence, but he wasn't ready, not to feel, not to open, not to follow the current you already surrendered to. And now, you're left holding a bond that still echoes, a connection that doesn't close, a man who felt like fate, but lives like absence. You keep asking yourself if you imagined it, if maybe it was all one-sided, if you mistook intensity for meaning. But you didn't. You woke him up. You reached a part of him he was still running from, and now he's haunted by what he can't forget. And you're haunted by what you can't return to. Because you were ready. But his soul is still catching up. And the worst part is, he knows. You didn't fall for a man. You fell through time. You fell into a memory that hadn't happened yet. Into a version of him he didn't know he was becoming. Into a love that arrived too early, like rain on dry land. Beautiful, but terrifying. Because he felt it too. The pull, the flood, the recognition. But his hands weren't ready to hold it. His spirit wasn't steady enough to stay. He wanted you. But wanting is not the same as readiness. And you, with your soft knowing and quiet bravery, you stayed open, you stayed honest, you let the current take you. Even as he hesitated, even as he twisted away from the very thing that softened him, even as he broke your heart, not with cruelty, but with absence. He didn't mean to disappear, but some men vanish in the presence of truth, because it exposes what they've hidden even from themselves. And you were that mirror, not of who he was, but of who he was meant to be. That's what made it feel holy, and that's what made it hurt. Because the soul moves slowly when it's afraid, and his was still asleep in places yours had already traveled. So you mistook recognition for readiness. You mistook awakening for agreement. You mistook love for presence. But the truth is quieter than all of that. You were the interruption. The moment his old self cracked. The moment his deeper life began, whether he follows it or not. And now, you are left with echoes. You are left with ache. You are left with a door only he can walk through. But deep down, you know, it wasn't a mistake. It was a message, not from him, from the future. It began like a soft collision, not loud, not fast, but undeniable, like the sound of something ancient breaking open beneath your skin. You weren't looking for him, but something in you was already listening. And when he appeared, it wasn't excitement you felt. It was remembrance, like standing in a house you'd never seen before, but somehow knew every window by heart. That's how the soul speaks, not with answers, but with recognition. and your body knew it before your mind had words. Your breath changed, your silence deepened, your fear grew quieter. But so did his, because while you moved toward him like the tide returning home, he stood at the edge, trying to decide if he could swim. He saw it too, the mirror, the pull, the ache. But he mistook it for danger, not destiny. Because love like this doesn't feel safe. It doesn't flatter the ego. It shatters it. And some souls are still too wrapped in armor to let love that deep come in. He smiled with his mouth. He stayed with his body. But something behind his eyes hesitated. You felt it. The flicker. The almost. The push and pull between his spirit and his fear. He wanted to stay, but not enough to become the man staying would require. And so he hovered, right at the threshold, where love becomes choice, where presence becomes sacrifice. And while he lingered there, you began to disappear, not all at once, but slowly, as women do when they start to feel the ache of being both seen and avoided at the same time. And that was the beginning, not of the story, but of the unraveling. He touched you without touching your life. That was the paradox. He reached a part of you no one else had ever seen, but refused to step fully into the world where you live. He tasted your depths, but stayed thirsty. He heard your truth, but kept pretending he didn't understand. And still, you gave. Not because you didn't know your worth, but because some part of you thought, if he just felt it enough, he would stay. If he just let it in far enough, he would choose. But you forgot one thing. Feeling doesn't equal readiness. And intimacy doesn't equal availability. Because he did feel it. That's what scared him most. You weren't a fantasy to him. You were a mirror. And mirrors don't lie. They reflect the exact distance between who he is and who he pretends to be. And so he pulled away. Not all at once, but in pieces. A missed call, a delayed reply, a shift in his gaze when your truth got too close. You noticed. Of course you did. Women like you feel the smallest withdrawals, but instead of naming it, you adjusted, you softened, you shrank, you stayed quiet, not out of weakness, but out of sacred hope. The hope that if you became less threatening, he would come closer. But he didn't. Because the real threat wasn't you. It was the part of himself that awakened in your presence. The part that wanted to be seen. The part that wanted to stay. The part that no longer fit inside his old life. And that part was louder than his logic, but not stronger than his fear. So he ran, not with his feet, but with his spirit. And the silence he left behind was louder than any goodbye. You became the ache he couldn't forget. Even now, when he tries to convince himself it wasn't real, when he tells himself he wasn't ready, when he numbs it with noise and comfort and control, you are still there, not in his mind, but in the silence between his distractions, in the quiet moments he can't outrun. Because you didn't touch the surface of him, you touched the threshold, the place where a man either steps forward or shatters. And that's what he felt with you. Not romance, not flattery, but soul disruption. You didn't awaken his desire, you awakened his becoming. And that terrified him. Because to love you fully, he would have to lose the self that keeps him safe. He would have to lay down the masks, the control, the detachment. He would have to feel. And for a man like him, a man who survived by staying numb. Feeling is a kind of death. So he did what scared men do. He left the fire, but kept the ember. He walked away, but never closed the door, because some part of him still returns. In dreams, in music, in moments he can't explain. And that part knows the truth, that you weren't a phase, you were a portal, that you weren't a detour, you were the path. But until his soul catches up to what his heart already knows, he will remain torn between the comfort of who he was and the calling of who he could be if he loved you fully. And you will remain in the space in between, not because you're waiting, but because you were the beginning of his awakening. And some awakenings come with silence before they come with return. You carry his ghost like a promise that never spoke, not a memory, a presence, the way the air still changes when you think of him, the way your body remembers what your mind tries to erase. Because when love enters without closure, it doesn't leave clean. It lingers in the seams. It echoes in the moments you least expect. You're not holding on. You're holding the weight of what never fully lived. And that weight is invisible. No one sees the conversation that never ended. No one hears the song that still starts in your chest. No one feels the way your heart pauses every time someone else tries to reach the place he once touched. They tell you to move on, but they don't see the tether. The invisible thread that still hums between your ribs when his name crosses your mind. Because it wasn't just love, it was recognition. It was the kind of love that bends time, the kind that arrives before it can stay, the kind that wounds because it remembers a future that hasn't happened yet. And now you walk with that ache, not as a victim, but as a vessel. Because some women are marked by the ones they awaken, not the ones who stay. And you touched the part of him that sleeps in most men forever. You opened the door. He turned away, but the wind still passes through. That's what haunts you. Not the loss, but the almost. Not the absence, but the knowing. And even now, you still feel him trying to find his way back. But you also know he must arrive as the man who can stay, not the boy who ran from his own reflection. You didn't lose him. You simply saw first. You simply loved first. You simply stood in a place he hadn't yet reached. And that's the cruelty of deep connection. It doesn't wait for both hearts to arrive at the same time. One always sees first. One always loves louder. One always opens wider. And that one was you. You felt the future in his silence. You saw the man hiding inside the hesitation. You spoke to the part of him that wasn't yet speaking. That's what made it feel like fate. That's what made it impossible to forget. Because it wasn't just about what happened. It was about what almost did. The way his spirit leaned in, just enough to stir yours. Just enough to make you believe he might step through. Just enough to awaken everything you'd been protecting. And once it's open, you can't unfeel it. You can't pretend you didn't recognize his soul. You can't erase the way your body softened in his presence. You can't unknow the way the universe paused, just long enough for you to believe it meant something. Because it did. But not in the way you hoped. Not as a story, but as a signal. A signal that your heart is ready, that your depth is real, that your love is not a wound, but a frequency. And he was the first to hear it. But hearing is not the same as answering. So now you live in the in-between. Between what you felt and what he feared. between the moment he met you and the moment he might become the man who can return, if he ever does. There's a silence that follows almost love, not emptiness, not peace, a silence that aches like an echo trapped between lifetimes. That's where you live now, not in grief, but in suspension. Because he didn't end it. Not really. He just stopped arriving. And so your heart was left mid-sentence, still speaking, still listening, still wide open to someone who no longer stood there. That's the wound no one sees, not the loss of him, but the absence of closure. The way you were left circling the doorway, waiting for a goodbye that never came. You tried to close it yourself. You tried to build distance where love had lived. You tried to make logic out of silence. But the soul doesn't work like that. The soul doesn't forget where it's been seen. And he saw you, even if only for a moment. He saw the whole of you, and for a heartbeat, he wanted it all. That wanting didn't vanish. It retreated, back into the shadows of his fear, back into the patterns he still clings to, but the impression remained, on him and on you. That's what makes it hard to breathe some nights. Not the memories, but the vibration still moving between you, like a bell that hasn't stopped ringing, even though he stopped listening. You don't need him to answer, but some part of you still aches for him to hear it, to admit what passed between you, to say aloud what was only ever spoken in silence. But he can't. Not yet. Because to name it would mean he was ready to claim it. And that kind of readiness requires a death of who he was. And he's still mourning the life he hasn't outgrown. Some loves come to break the rhythm, to interrupt the pattern, to unravel the cycle you didn't know you were still dancing inside. And he was that rupture, not just of your heart, but of your old silence. Because before him, you had grown quiet, not mute, but contained, measured, safe. And then he entered like a key you didn't know fit, not to open a door, but to unlock the voice buried beneath your ribs. You began to speak in ways you never had, say things out loud that had only lived in dreams. You began to feel hope again, not as fantasy, but as something that dared to stay when you looked in his eyes. He didn't give that to you, but his presence allowed it to rise. That was the gift, not his love, but what your love awakened in you. And even now, as he drifts further into his silence, you still carry the sound of your own return. The way you opened, the way you remembered, the way you stood at the edge of your longing and didn't flinch. He may have turned back, but you didn't. You kept walking. You kept feeling. You kept trusting the ache that told you this wasn't just about him. This was about the part of you that no longer fits inside small love. The part that will never again accept half connection. The part that now knows what real resonance feels like. And yes, it hurts to remember what you touched without being able to keep it. But some touches are initiations, some echoes are awakenings, and sometimes the soul of another only visits to return you to your own. You were not too much. You were exactly enough to awaken the part of him he had buried. That's why it felt like rejection, but deeper than ego. Like you were being pushed away by a man who hadn't fully arrived in his own body. Because you weren't being rejected, you were being postponed. Your love didn't threaten his heart. It threatened his defenses. It called forward the version of him that only existed in glimpses, in the softness behind his eyes, in the stillness between his words. But he wasn't ready to become that man. Not then. And so he collapsed under the weight of what you offered. Not because it was too heavy, but because it was too real. Because you asked for nothing and gave everything. Because you didn't perform, you revealed. And real love can feel like exposure to a man still hiding. So he withdrew, not from you, but from the self that loves you. And now you stand in the strange aftermath, where nothing dramatic happened. No betrayal, no final break, just the slow evaporation of presence. And it's easy to blame yourself in that silence, to wonder if you should have been quieter, softer, smaller. But love like yours doesn't ruin things. It reveals them. And what it revealed in him was the distance he still lives from his own truth. That's not your fault. That's not your burden. You were the invitation, not the obligation. And just because he couldn't rise to meet you doesn't mean you fell. You simply stood at the doorway long enough for him to see it. Whether he walks through or not is no longer your question to carry. There's a grief that has no funeral, a grief that lingers in the body, not because of death, but because of delay. Because you know he's still out there, still breathing, still living, still carrying the part of you he never returned. And that knowing, it haunts. It follows you into rooms where his name is never spoken. It echoes in your chest when another man reaches for your hand. Because no one warned you that unfinished love can ache louder than the ones that ended. At least endings have a door. This one only has silence, so you carry it. Not like a wound, but like a question. Not, why did he leave? But, why did he look at me like that? And still leave? Because the way he saw you, that wasn't confusion. That wasn't lust. That was knowing. And knowing demands responsibility. But he turned away from that responsibility like a man turning from the sun because he's afraid of what it might reveal. He still thinks he can forget you. He still thinks time will dull the echo. He still thinks distance will make it feel like a dream. But love like this doesn't fade. It waits, not for him to return, but for the day he finally admits that what he ran from was the most real thing he ever touched. And until then, you will keep walking, not forward, but deeper. Because this isn't about finding someone new. It's about becoming someone true. Someone who no longer shrinks in the face of delay. Someone who no longer makes herself smaller to make others feel ready. You were never too soon. He was just still asleep when the universe asked him to rise. There is a cruelty in being the one who sees first. Not because vision is a curse, but because seeing doesn't mean staying. You saw his soul before he could carry it. You felt the depth before it became safe. You arrived before he knew he was being called. And now, you hold the ache of timing. Not bad timing, sacred misalignment, because this was never random. This was choreography, divine and disruptive. You didn't meet him too early. You met him exactly when you were meant to, so you could remember who you are when no one chooses you back, so you could feel the weight of your own capacity, so you could shed the old skin of waiting and step into the woman who no longer needs delay to feel worthy. Because something inside you has changed. Not shattered, not broken, changed. You're not trying to forget him. You're learning to walk with the echo without letting it guide your steps. You're learning that readiness has nothing to do with time, and everything to do with willingness. And he wasn't willing, not to feel it fully, not to rise to meet what you offered, not to die to the life that kept him distant. But you were, and that willingness, it became your compass. Now you know what your heart can hold. Now you know what your spirit sounds like when it recognizes something holy. And that knowing, it changes how you love. It changes who you let in. It changes what you tolerate. Not because you're hardened, but because now you remember. You remember what it feels like to meet the truth and not turn away, even when it doesn't stay. Not all love stories end. Some just go quiet, not from lack, but from fear. And he was afraid, not of you, but of who he might become if he truly let you in. Because to stay would mean shedding the old self, shedding the safety of distance, shedding the illusion that love can exist without surrender. And he wasn't ready to surrender, so he silenced the call. But silence doesn't erase the soul. It only delays its becoming. And now you feel him still, not in memory, but in motion. The way the sky shifts when his name enters your mind. The way your chest tightens when a song reminds you of the space he never filled. You feel his soul trying to reach you. But you no longer extend your hand, because you've learned. You've learned that presence is louder than potential. That love must arrive not just as ache, but as action. You've learned that being seen isn't the same as being held. And most of all, you've learned to trust the door that didn't close, not as an invitation to wait, but as proof that the story was real, that the connection existed, that you weren't imagining it. You weren't delusional. You weren't needy. You weren't wrong. You were just early. You walked into the fire before he even smelled the smoke. You carried the flame before he believed it could warm him. And now, whether he returns or not, you carry the light. Not for him, for yourself, for the part of you that will never again settle for anything less than full. Maybe he was never meant to stay. Maybe his purpose was never presence, but ignition. Maybe the universe sent him not to complete your story, but to awaken the part of you that forgot how deep you love. Because he did see you. He just didn't stay long enough to believe it. He did feel it. He just didn't choose it. And that is not your failure. That is his path. A path he must walk alone until his soul grows brave enough to follow what his heart already knows. But you do not wait. You do not dim. You do not harden. You carry the ember he left behind, not as longing, but as proof. Proof that your love is real, that your knowing was sacred, that your timing was divine, even if his was not. You walk now with the quiet power of a woman who met herself in the ache. A woman who no longer begs for alignment, but listens for resonance. A woman who no longer proves her worth, but embodies it. And maybe, one day, his soul will catch up. Maybe he'll look back and finally understand what he touched and what he turned away from. Maybe he'll remember your eyes not as a comfort, but as a call. But even if he doesn't, you will have already returned to yourself, not as a consolation, as the purpose all along. Because this wasn't about finding him. It was about finding the version of you that no longer needs to be found. And in that stillness, you are free.